Thank you. Hello? Can you hear me? Oh. Hello? Hello? It's green. It is working? It's mainly for, okay, great. Thanks for coming. I also have a couple of books, and I'm going to refer to one of them, and I have a couple quotes from one of them on your handout. I know I made a handout. I'm so cheesy. It's my teacher side. I wanted to get through all of that, and I didn't want to be rushing through the screen so quickly that you won't be able to see it or write it down if you wanted to, so that's what that's for. The two books I brought, which you're also welcome to take a look at, take a picture of, is this one's called Revelation for Everyone by N.T. Wright, and he's my favorite. He's probably the most famous New Testament scholar alive today. He's a bishop in the Anglican Church, so he has that whole pastoral side to him too. But he has revolutionized the field of New Testament studies. He's that important. And he's written a series for everyone on the entire New Testament. So this is the Revelation one. He'll bring in relevant kind of academic stuff, but also he wants it to be relevant, applicable to the church today. He has that concern. So there's that one. And this is the one I'm actually going to quote from a few times. Craig Kester is a professor at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. We're from Minnesota, so he was right down the road. And he, again, has very much a pastoral concern. What he does that I really like is that he has chapters on, for example, how Revelation has been read by the church throughout the last 2,000 years, just to give you a big picture kind of overview of how people have looked at this book. And that kind of thing can be really helpful, too, if you're coming to Revelation for the first time or for one of the first times. So he does a lot of that. I really like him, too. This one's called Revelation and the End of All Things. Craig Kester. I think I have his name on there at some point, Kester. I should. After one of my quotes, I should. Could be on the back. Could be. Okay, so we're going to do tonight what we did last week, which is to have me talk you through some sort of basic issues in understanding Revelation as a genre, as a type of literature. And then I'm going to give you an example of what this looks like in a specific text, and then I'm going to request nicely that you practice it with your group, like we did last time, and then we'll come back together at the end and debrief quickly. But first I have two funnies. This is supposed to be funny. And this is on the top of your handout. Ha 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 ha. Though St. John the Evangelist saw many strange monsters in his vision, he saw no creature so wild as one of his own commentators. I tell my students this is where we laugh our academic laugh. Because that's supposed to be funny. And then this picture, this is purple, which is even funnier. It's not purple on your sheet. I don't care if you can't find your horse. You're not writing to the apocalypse on that. Of course, another reason I like this is that it already points to something that I'm going to make hopefully clear tonight in several different ways, is that you already have to be somewhat of an insider to even get this cartoon. It's referring to a specific text in Revelation where there are 4 horsemen. And they're different colors. Not purple, though. They're colors like red and black and pale. And they're scary. And then, this one is not scary and it's purple, yay! So already you have to be an insider to even get this, and that is so much of what Revelation is about, written to an insider community. So to help us become insiders, because probably, honestly, most of us aren't, at least at first glance, in terms of the kind of literature this is, in terms of genre, we just don't have a great category for it in our world today. So it's a little different than last week where we were in narrative and I kept saying, hey, we're good at this. We've read novels, we've watched movies, we get stories. This is a little different, so we need to do a bit more kind of groundwork so that we can read it well or hear it well. Revelation, this is another kind of funny, technically means unveiling or revealing. Right? Because so many people have thought that it's not very unveiled. It's veiled. What? I don't understand what's going on in this book. It's not revealing anything. It's confusing everything. That's been a very common experience when people read or hear Revelation, which already tells us again that we're probably outsiders. If we come to Revelation and all we feel is confused, an insider wouldn't feel that way necessarily. And that's not a bad thing for us to be outsiders. We're not first century people who had a category for this. What it does mean is that we get to discover and explore how to read this book. Most scholars think this is actually a compilation genre book, 3 genres. And we have compilation genre stuff in our culture today too. We have mixed genre music. I hear it all the time. One of my students said recently to me actually, he said, Dr. Beers, I feel like every song these days on the radio has some kind of rapper who, makes a guest appearance and raps. And I said, hey, that is pretty common these days. I think you might be right about that. The mixing of genres is something that we're used to, just maybe not with this kind of thing, but we know what that's like in other areas, in music or in movies. One of the genres is letter, which John talked about a couple of weeks ago. This is addressed to specific churches, letters to churches in a specific part of the world, Asia Minor, which is what do we call that part of the world today? What country do we call that? Turkey. So it's addressed to specific churches, a letter to the church here, a letter to the church there. We know where all of those cities and locations are in the first couple of chapters, by the way. People have done major archaeological digs and are still doing work there. These are real places. What this reminds us of when we read Revelation is there was a specific historical context for this book. This was addressed to real people in real places in the first century, and we know where they are, and we know a lot about those locations, and we need to take that seriously when we read Revelation. This isn't just something kind of up in the clouds. This was written to people on the ground who ideally would have understood what was going on. Otherwise, John's not a very good communicator, probably. Also, this means that it's meant to be read aloud. So this is where I'm going to get kind of cheesy tonight and read stuff aloud and act it out even in my own 7.5 months pregnant way, because letters in the first century were read, performed aloud for audiences. They were expected to hear it and experience it in a way that often isn't true today, because we are all, for one thing, we can all read, and a lot of people in the first century couldn't read, but we experience it quietly and privately so often as we read. Silently to ourselves. I want us to experience it on a different kind of level tonight. And that's, again, my cheesy side coming out, I know, but I can't help it. It's more fun that way. Second genre, prophecy. And John actually calls it a prophecy, or at least partly a prophecy, in chapter 1, verse 3. What this means for us hearing Revelation is that Revelation is speaking to the future, at least in some senses. Everyone agrees, but when you think about the prophets in the Old Testament, were they always talking about distant future? Well, sometimes they are, but very often they're saying, right now, in this moment, right now, you guys are, whoa, yikes, you stink. You're so unfaithful right now in this moment, and God is going to judge you soon, tomorrow, next week. Often prophecy in the Old Testament has much more of a present-oriented kind of feel to it. It's not just about distant future, something out there. It's meant to be meaningful in their realities, in their present circumstances. So we're going to take that seriously. It also means that there are conditional aspects to the book. What I mean by that is that there's a lot of judgment in Revelation, a lot of these violent kinds of scenes, and people have said, I don't like it. I don't like it. It scares me. Well, if you take prophecy seriously, what that means is that this judgment stuff isn't all necessarily a foregone conclusion. Prophecy has an if-then component to it. Prophecy is about warning. If you continue in your unfaithfulness, then yes, judgment. But what if you don't continue in unfaithfulness? No judgment. So people often read Revelation as if, oh my word, everything, uh-oh, honey, everything's going to be, I guess I can work up the handout too. Everything is just kind of all predetermined. That's not how Revelation works, actually. Most of us think. Finally, Revelation or Apocalypse as the dominant genre. The most important thing here for us to get is that the purpose, or the kind of language it is symbolic. This is not literal language. These are symbols. This is imagery. This is metaphorical stuff. Broad agreement on that in scholarship, by the way. That's not Holly's random idea. That's how the kind of literature works. Thank you. So if we come to Revelation and we start reading it literally, in other words, we're misreading it. The beast who comes up out of the sea in chapter 13, roar. Okay, he doesn't really roar, but picture him dripping wet, and he's a beast. He's supposed to be scary. That's not a literal beast, in other words. He's a symbol for something else. The question is, what is that something else? Because that's how this genre communicates. The second piece under Revelation or Apocalypse here is that the purpose is encouragement. And this one's so funny to me because often Revelation scares us. People read Revelation and they walk away and they say, oh my word, I'm terrified. Never reading that book again. Super scary. If we walk away and all we're left with is fear, we have misread the book. The point of Apocalypse is to encourage people, to encourage the faithful. Because are the faithful going to experience all of those horrible judgments? No. Will the faithful have moments of persecution? Yes, but does God take care of that and vindicate them? Yes. So if we walk away from Revelation and we think, oh my word, yikes, terrible, I want to say to us, hey, read again. Read again. This is supposed to be encouraging for the believers. That's how it would have been read and heard in the first century. So I'll talk more about that when I'm in my example.
Some of these have been read before, much like the Greeks would have had theater.
We think so. Yep. So, performed in a variety of ways from a single person maybe who could actually read up in front, kind of performing individually, up to more kind of broader performances with more complicated stuff going on. Yeah. Big picture. In Revelation, the big point is that God wins. I will be really redundant with this tonight. And I'll say, who wins in the end? And you'll say, God. God wins. God wins. Which is encouraging. Remember, this is Apocalypse. The genre functions to encourage people. Well, it's pretty encouraging to always remember that God wins. Even when you're in the midst of that part in chapter 14 that's super scary and you think, keep reading, because you'll be reminded that God wins. In the cosmic fight between God and evil, God wins. Those who are on God's side win too. By showing his readers their present world as it looks from the vantage point of God's dimension, John hopes to transform their understanding of the world. This is a perspective book. Does God know that God wins? Yep, God knows. So if we forget, if these believers in these churches in the first century forgot, they need to be reminded. God's perspective. God knows that God wins. Remember. And I remind myself of this sometimes when I look around at our world and I think, this place is a hole. Everything's falling apart and injustice everywhere and evil's winning. Yep. And then I say, this is how cheesy I am in real life. I say, nope, Revelation, Holly, Revelation. God wins. God wins in the end. And of course, this ends the New Testament. This book ends the canon, the whole Bible. What a powerful, fantastic way to conclude the Bible. With this graphic, in good and bad ways, portrayal of God winning in the end. So, a few things about symbolism, because remember, our dominant genre is Revelation or Apocalypse. That's the same word. In Greek, it sounds like apocalypsis. So if you just make that sound like English, you say apocalypse. But if you actually translate it into English, it's Revelation. Same thing, though. In terms of symbols, which, by the way, are not meant to conceal, but to reveal, they're not supposed to be confusing. So if we come to them and we're super confused, that just reminds us again, shoot, I'm not a first century person. I'm an outsider to this, which I tell myself all the time. This is what I do for a living, remember. So, 8 times a week in my office, I read something and I think, oh my word, I didn't know that, obviously, intuitively, because I'm not a first century person. Ugh, bless my heart. I had to work at that. So I think this can be very good for us to remember that. Keeps us humble. Sure keeps me humble, because I remind myself of it every day. I'm confronted with it every day. So cities and people as symbols. We're going to look at a couple passages where people are used as symbols. But in chapter 21, the city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, is a symbol for the people of God. Almost everyone thinks that. partly because, that's chapter 21, in 20 verse 9, John actually says the city is God's people. So that's helpful. In case we might be confused, if you read it all together, you realize, oh, John already told us this, the city, the people of God. So a city to function, to be interpreted as the people of God is one of the ways that Revelation communicates, which means that if we see that city picture, that city symbol, and we say, oh my word, it's a real city, it means that we're probably not hearing it the way John wanted us to hear it. He wants to communicate something about the people of God. What is that? And that's where we would discuss the passage. So yes, sometimes the symbols are interpreted. This is very helpful for people like us who need help interpreting the symbols. It also means probably that there are moments where John is aware that some people in his audience might not obviously intuitively get it, and it needs to be clarified so that there isn't confusion. So this makes me feel good too. I think, oh good, even back then, 2,000 years ago, there were people who maybe needed a little help to make sure that they weren't going off down the wrong track. So in chapter 1, verse 20, there are these 7 lampstands, which is a symbol. Great, what are those? Lampstands. And the Son of Man, who's Jesus, is walking among the lampstands. What does that mean? John tells us the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches, which maybe he thought was confusing enough that need to be clarified. And then, of course, the 7 churches are the ones who get this letter in chapters 2 and 3. Colors as symbols. This we should feel great about. I feel like these make a pretty good connection to our context. White as standing for righteousness or purity. We feel good about that one? Do we often use white that way in our world? Yes, good. We've got this one. One down. Gold as symbolizing something of great value. Same thing with our jewels or kind of precious metals, all fits under that category. Red is symbolizing blood, which leads to destruction and death. At least sometimes we can use red that way. Maybe not all the time, but I bet you're pretty good at intuiting when it's supposed to mean that. If you see someone wearing red along with other parts of a costume on Halloween, you probably think, oh, I see what you're doing there. I get it. Whereas if I had a red shirt on tonight, you probably wouldn't think, oh, what is Holly trying to communicate? What does that color mean? Your decision on this is shaped by other factors, like the fact that on Halloween, you expect people to be scary and wear costumes that are scary. That's the genre piece. Purple is symbolizing royalty. I feel pretty good about that one too for our world. We at least sometimes do that. Numbers, we might not do this quite as much. Numbers as symbols. 7 and 10 is symbolizing perfection or completion. 7 is one of the favorite Jewish numbers. Symbolize something that's full, complete, done. Shows up in places like where in the Bible? In the Bible generally. Creation. Here, yes. Mm-hmm. Actually, yeah, you might be right. There might be a 7-year drought in the Old Testament somewhere. 10 plagues. Yes, so these are very appropriate Jewish numbers. 7 is even more distinctly Jewish probably than 10. 10 had this function in the larger world, outside of Jewish circles even. But it gets used with a ton of stuff in Revelation. So we just need to notice that and say whenever we see a 7, there's a claim being made here for fullness. Something is being completed. 12, used to symbolize the people of God and related ideas. And why is this? Because in the Old Testament there are 12 tribes. 12 tribes who were originally 12 brothers, part of a family, as the people of God family. So when we see 12 numbers, or multiples of them, we say there's a people of God thing going on right here. I see it. I see it. So the 144,000 in 14:1, this is the group that is faithful. I'll read you a couple of these. Then I looked, this is John. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. Oh, there's a real literal lamb standing on Mount Zion. Oh, wait, no, that's a symbol for something, right? The lamb is a symbol for who do you think that is? Yay, you're so good at this. Yes, good. There's Jesus, and with him, 144,000. who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. This 144,000. I mean, I will admit that there have been some Jewish, or not Jewish, Christian traditions who've tried to argue that this is a real number, a literal number, 144,000. The weight of evidence is hugely against that in terms of the whole book, though, because everywhere else you look, numbers are used symbolically, and there's broad agreement about that. So if we want to argue that this one number now is literal, you need to make a really good case for it. Because why only this one? What about the other ones? So that becomes an issue that people talk about. The New Jerusalem gets described with 12s, which is appropriate because the New Jerusalem, the city, is what again? The city is God's people. Yes, how appropriate. The apostles. The number 3.5, this one was so helpful for me when I first learned it. I thought, oh my word, makes total sense. Revelation will often say things like a time, times, and half a time. It's 3.5. That's how it often communicates it, though, and my whole life I wondered. I grew up reading Revelation. I wasn't sure what to do with it, but we sure read it a lot where I come from, and I had no idea. There's general agreement, again, not everyone, but general agreement within the sort of mainstream scholarship that this symbolizes a limited period of affliction, which makes sense because if 7 symbolizes wholeness or completeness, half of that is something that's limited. And it gets used in context of affliction, of persecution, as a very powerful way to communicate that this persecution, this affliction isn't going to last forever. It's not a 7, praise God. It's a 3.5. Phew. I'm relieved. I wanted it to be a 3.5. Then the number 666, which no one has ever heard of in our world today, right? I feel like across our broader culture, people use this number, usually as, the devil's number or something like that. What does it mean in Revelation? General agreement that it's symbolic. What does it point to? Scholars say at a first level, oh, it's like it's almost 7s, but not quite. So close. So close. So there's a kind of a point of imperfection being made. Like, oh, you want it to be a 7 because the 666 figure is bad. It's the beast. Oh, the beast was aspiring to be a 7, but he's only a 6. So we think that's partly what's going on. John then says, though, that if you add up, it's the number of a man, and basically you can add up and figure out who it is. And so there's been, since the first century, people have been trying to figure out who this is, and candidates have ranged from popes to people like Hitler. One of the issues is that, of course, if you're creative, you can find a lot of people who add up to 666. In the first century, because remember, this is written to people in the first century, what would this have meant to them? That's probably a helpful question to ask because they were the first audience. And what's interesting about that is that if you add up Nero's name in Hebrew letters, it's a 666. And some people have said, well, I don't like that because he lived a long time ago. What does that mean? There are no 666s for us? And I would say, hold that question for a moment until we really address this first century issue. If you're a first century believer, is Nero an appropriate 666 figure? What has he done? What is he famous for doing? Persecuting Christians. He used them as torches in his garden. He burned them on stakes. That kind of thing. He's a pretty good 666 to start with. So some people say it's only Nero and no one else ever again. Other people, of course, say it's not Nero. It's only someone in the future that we haven't seen yet. Who could it be? And I've heard people suggest, presidents and other various world leaders. That's not very convincing to me or to most people who do what I do because that wouldn't have been very meaningful for a first century audience. However, I am comfortable with saying, hey, they had a very good 666 candidate, and maybe he isn't the only one who has ever come or will ever come. So I'm open to discussing it beyond that, but I don't want to lose that first century piece. This book had to have been meaningful for people who were its original recipients, unless we want to start saying things like, well, John is writing to them, but they wouldn't have understood it. Really? This was for them, but they wouldn't have understood it. It's only for us. I've heard people make that argument. It's highly dissatisfying to me on a number of levels. Yes? Yes, that's one way to do it. A would be 1, B would be worth 2, C would be worth 3. It was a very common practice in the ancient world. It's called gematria. It's common enough where you see it in graffiti. So there's this famous graffiti in Pompeii where this guy apparently says, I love her whose number is, I think it's 545. That's what he calls her. And of course, that's only helpful and meaningful if people understand what he's doing. So we think it was very common. So in other words, something is being used here that they would be familiar with to add up the numbers of someone's name. But the symbols are not the message. I don't want to get stuck on the symbols. I always want to say, what do the symbols communicate? What are they pointing toward? Sure. Gematria, Gematria. Mm-hmm. This is another reason why I gave you a handout, because this is too small. But this is such a good quote from Kester. Good job, Kester. Big question about Revelation is whether the timeline is linear or cyclical. In other words, do we start with chapter 1 at a certain date, and then we can kind of plot things throughout history until we get to the end at a certain date, and it's linear that way. It goes in order. There are some groups, Christian groups, who've argued that. Might be helpful for you to know that as a distinct minority position by people who actually study this and work on this book. Most people who work on Revelation see a cyclical timeline. In other words, see kind of an overlapping thing where the same ideas are getting repeated, even if the visions are a little different, even if the images are a little different, the same ideas are getting repeated again and again, and then you can't plot it on a timeline. Reasons for this include things like in chapter 6 or 7, all the grass gets burned up in one of the visions, all the grass. But by chapter 8, guess what's back? The grass is back. Or it'll say, all the stars fell from the sky. And then a couple of chapters later, the stars are back in the sky. And so people have said, whoa, okay. Either if we're going to be consistent with a literal time or a linear and literal timeline, we need to say, I guess all the grass gets burned up, but then it grows back again. And then it gets destroyed again. Or all the stars fall down, but then God makes new stars. Or puts the stars back up there. That's the kind of argument you have to start making if you want it to be linear. And of course, people who do this say, this is a symbolic genre. Does it make sense to see a linear kind of timeline in a symbolic genre, in images? Not necessarily. Those things don't go together. So most scholars go this direction. If we need to talk about that more later, even you and me, we can. But here's how Kester frames it. Those who read Revelation as a whole, always as a whole, always, encounter visions that alternatively threaten and assure them. Yeah. The scary ones are the ones we focus on most. But what about the assurance ones? With increasing intensity, the visions at the bottom of the spiral threaten the reader's sense of security by confronting them with horsemen that represent conquest. Violence, hardship, and death, by portents in heaven, earth, and sea. I mean, this is stars falling from the sky kind of language. That's scary. By seemingly insuperable adversaries who oppose those who worship God and Christ. Nevertheless, each time the clamor of conflict becomes unbearable, listeners are transported into the presence of God, the Lamb, Jesus, and the heavenly chorus, and that's the reassurance piece. So if you're reading Revelation and you're in a terrifying moment, the most helpful thing I can say to you is to keep reading, because you'll get to the end of a cycle where you'll end up back in the presence of God and you'll say, I needed this. I needed to be here. Oh yeah, and that's right, God wins. Yes? Linear would be arguing that, well, maybe those first few chapters are in the first century because those are the first century churches. But then starting with chapter 4, maybe we're in the 2nd century or the 3rd century. That stuff happened then. And then with chapter 5 or 6, maybe we're now up to the 5th century and we're kind of working our way through. Or some people say those first few chapters are 1st century, but chapters 4 through 22 are all 21st century. And all of this is going to happen in an organized kind of chronological fashion. What do you mean by what do they do with the Old Testament? Some people would argue that, but actually a lot of people who argue that Revelation is linear would very much value the Old Testament and say that just came before. That's pre-Jesus stuff, but it's still valued. This is post-Jesus stuff. The people who want to read this in a linear way often would say that most of Revelation we haven't seen yet. Well, there are groups who do that, who want to read this as happening in order. So, of course, I'm sympathetic to the desire to do this because that means that if you can figure out where we are in chapter 6, verse 7. Then you think, oh, my word, yeah, okay, whew. Now I know what's gone before me, and now I know what's coming, so I can prepare for the next thing. That's the desire. That's the desire. It might be helpful to know, again, that that's very much a minority position in scholarship. So if that's helpful for you as you think about this.
Cyclical patterns are familiar to people who are familiar with the Old Testament as well.
Yes. Yes. This genre is known. First century Jews would have understood this genre, apocalyptic, and that kind of cyclical thing is often part of it. So they would have been familiar with the category in a way that we are not. Oh, bless our hearts, I know. Okay. So I was told to be done at 8:05 because we're doing communion, but I wanted to give you a quick example.
Great pictures on there.
Those are the churches, I think. So let's look at chapter 12 and do some work together, and then for a couple minutes, and then I'd like you to practice with your groups chapter 17. There's general agreement that Revelation 12 to 22 is Act 2, or Part 2. It's the second half of the book, and that the big point there is the defeat of Satan, which makes sense because the big point of the whole book is God wins. So you got to defeat Satan for God to win. So that's how this fits in the whole book. We meet a mother figure in chapter 12. 12:1. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Ooh. She's a woman. Literally? Probably not. She's symbolizing something. What is she symbolizing? What do you notice about her description in that first verse? She's pregnant. Yeah, that's verse 2. I know something about that. She's got those 12 stars on her head, which points to what? 12 tribes. This is a people of God number. So almost everybody thinks she symbolizes the people of God. She's a woman, but she's a symbol for the people of God. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Yes, that is how it works, right? Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Ah! This guy's scary, right? An enormous red, what does red mean? Blood. Destruction, death, yes. Oh, what are these though? 7 heads and 10 horns. They're numbers of completion or fullness. We have 2 good options for what's going on here. And then the 7 crowns. Okay, this dragon is clearly aspiring to kingship. The 7 and 10, we think either points to the fullness or completeness of the sort of evilness of the dragon. Fully evil, fully complete. Or maybe he's wanting to be a 7 and a 10, but we look at the rest of his characterization. He's a scary dragon. Yikes. He's red. And we say, boo, you are an imposter. You're claiming 7s and 10s for yourself, but we know, we can tell that that's fake. You want it, but we're not going to give it to you. So one of those 2 options is what we think that's supposed to communicate. Its tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. Ah, right? The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. How do we feel about this? This is disgusting. This is repulsive. And we say, we knew it. We knew you were bad. We knew at the moment we saw you were a dragon. We knew it. So what happens? She gives birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. That sounds, if we know our Old Testament, that sounds like Psalms 2 about kings, about Israel's king kind of language. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. It's an appropriate place for a king to go, even a baby king. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. How long do you think that is if you had to break that up into years? 1,260 days? Three and a half. According to an ancient calendar, that's a 3.5-year span. She's there. Sneaky. Want to hear something really interesting about this? There's a story. Do I have it on here? I do. A story from the ancient world with a dragon named Python and a pregnant woman named Leto. She's the mother of Apollo. Apollo is a very important god in the Greco-Roman world. He's the god of literature and music and art and war. And there are temples to him everywhere. The dragon pursues the woman. The north wind rescues her. She gives birth to Apollo and Artemis, an important goddess, a very prominent goddess in their world. And Apollo chases and kills the dragon. How did Rome use this? This is my favorite part. Roman emperors liked to associate themselves with Apollo. You see what they're doing here? They're taking a story that's known in their world and they're saying, look who I am, I'm Apollo, I'm the super awesome one who has defeated the dragon for you. Now be grateful. Look what I've done for you. I've brought in all this peace and prosperity. I've protected you. Now be grateful. That's how the story got used in the ancient world. What's so powerful about the way it gets used here in Revelation is that John subverts it. Takes something that they would know, takes something that they know how their emperors are using it, their kings are using it, and puts Jesus basically in the Apollo slot. Jesus is the one who truly brings deliverance from the dragon. Isn't that so fun? I know. God wins. So she goes, the mother, when she flees, she goes to the wilderness. Why is that an interesting place for her to go? That's where Hagar went. Someone spent 40 years wandering around the wilderness. Who was that? Israel, God's people. Oh, wait, but she's God's people. She's God's people. She goes to the wilderness. So this could be a bless our hearts moment where you think, oh my word, how am I supposed to catch all this stuff? And you know what? That's where a good book like this or one of John's books will help you make some of the connections. However, when you start to make them, it can be so fun and rewarding. Trust me, it's super rewarding. This is my favorite part of the whole story, though. And there was war in heaven. So after the baby boy gets taken to God's throne, there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan. In other words, we don't want you to be confused about who the dragon is, so we're just going to tell you. Satan, the devil. So that ancient serpent who leads the whole world astray, he was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. I think I give you a quote. That's awesome. I do. The enthronement of Jesus leads to war in heaven, and the dragon is cast down or restricted to earth. This is from Kester. From a heavenly perspective, evil rages on earth not because it is so powerful, but because it is so vulnerable. In terms of how the story is being portrayed, this is what happens. After Jesus is enthroned as king, which is totally appropriate because Jesus is king, right? Yes, awesome. Satan is super mad, understandably, because he knows he's losing ground, because he knows God wins. So he fights, and we say, silly choice. Really, you think that's going to accomplish anything? But he does, and what happens is that he loses ground. Apparently, Satan used to have access to heaven and earth. And after he loses this battle, he's restricted to earth. He no longer has access to heaven in a way that he used to. And he's so furious because he's cast down to earth. and he rages. He rages against the people of God. But you know what? He rages not because he is so powerful, but because he is so vulnerable. Because he's been restricted already and he knows it. Because in and what Jesus has done, what Jesus has accomplished, yay, Easter, Satan knows his territory.